Good morning, class. Today I'm reading chapter 16 from our book, Weasel. I hope you've been enjoying this book as much as I have. Chapter 16. Silently, I crept out of bed, dressed, and put on my coat, boots, hat, and gloves. I found Pa's gun and some bullets. I was going to find Weasel. Pa wouldn't like it, but hadn't he said we had to do the best we could on our own? I was about to leave when I saw Molly's papers and pens on the table, and I decided to write a letter to Pa. But after a few starts, I crumpled the paper and threw it in the fire. I didn't know myself what I was going to do, so how could I tell Pa? I eased quietly out the door. It was late February, and we were having what Pa called sucker spring. That meant warm weather that tried to fool you into thinking winter was over. The snow was grainy and wet, so my footsteps made a squishy sound as I walked. The moon shining on the snow made the night seem almost as bright as day. I had made the journey to Weasel's cabin so many times in my mind that I didn't hesitate about which way to go. For a minute, I stopped to consider whether I ought to take Job. It would be a lot faster, and I would have liked his company. But I felt bad enough about sneaking out without telling Pa, and if something happened to me, I'd be leaving Ma and Pa without a gun or a horse. Better to walk, I decided. The way I figured it, I'd get near Weasel's cabin and wait until daylight, when he'd most likely be sleeping, and I'd sneak up and what? Kill a sleeping man? I guess you'll know what to do when you have to do it, I told myself. Maybe it was true. All I really knew was that I had to do something. I had to go back. I hurried on, trying to keep my mind empty. When the sky began to show bright in the east, I figured I was pretty close to Weasel's place. I stopped and hid myself in a thick stand of spruce trees where I'd be out of the wind and safe from Weasel's eyes. No sense in meeting up with him as he made his way home. It was hard to stay still. I was so jumpy. Every tree branch scraping in the wind made me turn, expecting to see Weasel step right into my hiding place. At last, the day dawned, gray and solemn, and I figured Weasel would most likely be home by now and fixing to sleep. I came out and began walking slowly toward where I thought his cabin was. I didn't want any pesky crows or blue jays sounding off and warning Weasel that someone was coming, so I took my time. I had to circle back and around a few times until there it was, Weasel's cabin. I could feel my heart begin to thump as I remembered lying helpless on the floor while Weasel told his awful tales. I imagined the scene inside, Weasel asleep on his pile of filthy furs, not knowing I was sneaking up on him, just like he'd gone sneaking up on so many others. Keeping that in my mind, I crept closer. I had that same cold feeling as before when I'd been trapped in the cabin, the coldness that shut out everything but Weasel and what I had to do next. I was surprised to see that the door was open a crack. Holding my breath, I stepped forward to peer through the opening, sure I'd find myself face to face with Weasel. There was a sudden burst of sound as a grouse broke from the cover of a nearby tree in a flurry of beating wings, scaring me half out of my wits. Ah! My breath came rushing out in a cry of surprise. Then something dark and furry ran out of the cabin right past my feet. Screaming now, I fell backward into the snow, my gun flying out of my hands. As my scream echoed through the forest, I waited for the door to open wide and for Weasel to say, "So it's you again, boy. Only this time you ain't got a gun in your hand." But the echo died away and a deep silence filled the woods. No one came to the door, nothing moved. As I lay there, I remembered a silence like this. It was the day I returned home to find the animals gone and Ms. Tiz dead. Slowly, I came to see what I'd been too worked up to notice before. There were no footprints in the snow around the cabin except for mine and some of the small animals and birds. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. An awful feeling came over me then. I remember that the cabin hadn't smelled real good before, but the stink coming from it now was about the worst I'd ever smelled. I knew what it meant. I wanted to turn and run from it as fast as I could. but I had to see what was in there. I had to know. I made myself open the cabin door and step inside. I jumped as more small creatures went squeaking and scuttling into the dark corners. In the dim light, my eyes were drawn to the pile of skins that was Weasel's bed. Taking one step closer, I could see the form of a man huddled under the skins, or leastways what used to be a man. I couldn't see a face or anything that looked human at all, but it was Weasel all right. There was no doubt about that. The stream of light coming through the doorway fell on a tangle of matted hair, brown hair, and caught a patch of pure white, making it stand out in the darkness clear as could be. Covering my mouth, I turned and began running through the snow. I don't know how long I ran through the forest, choking and crying, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life and more scared. What I'd seen was too awful to think about, but it meant Weasel was dead. Weasel? Dead? I couldn't take it in. After a long time, I stopped running and leaned, gasping against a tree. I looked around and it came to me that without thinking about it, I was heading for Ezra's house. It made me feel better to think I was near Ezra, and I kept on running till I thought my heart was going to burst wide open. And suddenly, like before, there was Ezra coming toward me through the woods. Ezra, I cried. Ezra ran to meet me. His strong arms pulled me close and held me until I could stop my crying and shaking. He kept his arms around my shoulders while I wiped my face on my sleeve. Even then, it was a while before I could tell him what had happened. When I finished, I started crying and shivering all over again. Ezra picked me right up and carried me to the wigwam. He fed me and gave me something hot to drink and wrapped me in blankets by the fire. I think I even slept a little, but when I woke up, Ezra was right next to me. Ezra, I said, Weasel, he's dead. Ezra nodded. He must have. It looked like he died all by himself in his bed. A sudden thought struck me. Ezra, I wondered, do you think Weasel might have died of poison? You know, from where he shot himself in the foot? If his leg got real bad, he would have been too sick to hunt, too sick to get food and water. My voice dropped off as I thought about the way Weasel must have died. It was awful to think about. Alone, hurt, sick, and hungry, and thirsty. The way Pa would have died if Weasel had had his way. Pa said Weasel would get what he deserves, I said, and I sat there thinking how strange it was and how right somehow. After a while, Ezra got up and came back to the fire with something in his hands. It was a shovel. He stood looking at me, and all at once I understood. He meant for us to go back there, to the cabin, to bury Weasel. At first I couldn't believe it. I never wanted to go back there, ever. And Ezra hated Weasel too. Why would he want to bury him? I tried to remember what Pa had said about burying. It seemed like it had more to do with the folks doing the burying than with who it was getting buried. Weasel was a savage, I thought, but we aren't. Ezra and me burying Weasel, somehow that seemed right, too. I got up from my place by the fire, and we followed my trail back to the cabin through the snow. We chose a spot where the sun had warmed the ground a little, but even with that and the thaw we had, it was rough digging. We took turns scraping more than digging the frozen earth until we made a shallow grave. Then we went inside, wrapped the skins around what was left of Weasel, and dragged the whole pile into the hole. After we filled the dirt, we covered it with the biggest rocks we could carry to keep the animals out. Another grave, I thought. How many graves had to be dug because of you, Weasel? I looked at Ezra. There were no tears at this burial, no pretty words to say. It was over. Weasel was dead and buried. Are you happy now, Ezra? I felt. Am I? All I could think about was how tired I felt. Then I remembered Crabapple. There wasn't a sign of him anywhere. He must have run away, I decided. I imagined him running free and wild in the woods, doing as he pleased, and I smiled. Stubborn or old Crabby. He probably liked it just fine. Ezra and I turned away from Weasel's grave and walked into the forest together. Ezra stayed with me until we could see our cabin in the distance, and then he stopped. Wait, Ezra, please don't go yet. I have to get something, I said. I ran to the stone wall and got Molly's letter and handed it to Ezra, saying, "It's from Molly. It would mean a lot to her if you'd write back. It would mean a lot to all of us to know how you're doing. We think about you all the time." Ezra grasped the letter in both my hands in his. He looked at me and smiled. Then he stared off past me for a long moment. His eyes seemed to be looking at a new place, and I wished, like always, that I knew what he was seeing. He squeezed my hands hard, then turned to go. I watched him disappear into the trees. "Goodbye, Ezra," I called. "Goodbye." Pa could barely speak when he saw me. He was glad I was home safe and mad as a hornet at me for going, both at the same time. "I didn't mean to worry you, Pa," I said. "It was just something I had to do. Weasel's dead." From the look on his face, I knew he was afraid of what I had done. "No, Pa," I said. "I didn't kill him. I told Pa and Molly the whole story. It was strange. I had thought I'd feel so good when Weasel was dead, carefree and happy like before, but it wasn't like that. I felt different. Better, mostly, I guess. But Pa was right. It didn't make the things Weasel had done go away or the hurt of them. I still thought about Ezra at night and wished I could help him. And I had terrible dreams about Weasel's cabin and what I had seen there." That's where chapter 16 ends. Sorry for me moving around. My cat was trying to knock over my stand. So with that, that is the end of this chapter. We only have 3 more to go. Awesome. Bye, guys.